Boker Tov, everyone. Today we're going to discuss a topic which is something that's often taken for granted, and that'll kind of be the underlying theme. As we read through the Torah, there are often things that we read, whether we translate them or different concepts, and we understand it in a certain way. And the reason we understand it that way is because we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of interpretation that expresses the way that we should understand it. Now, it doesn't mean that that understanding is wrong, but sometimes if we were to go back to the text and read it a little closely, we might say, oh, my goodness, that may not be what it's saying. And again, that doesn't mean it's not what the Torah is saying, but sometimes it's valuable to go back to the text and read it a little bit more closely and deepen our understanding of it, and then kind of understand how we got from what's written in the text to our understanding today. So, Jane, I'm going to unmute you first. And then there's a trivia question, and it's not a difficult one because there's a massive clue in front of you, but I'll start by this. When a new Jewish community is started, a new Jewish town is started, what is the first infrastructure, the first kind of building that they need to build? It is and huge clue right in front of you, name of the class.
Well, I guess you're going to want me to say a mikveh, but actually, from my understanding of American Jewish history, the first thing that Jews do when they settle is they have a cemetery. So I'm going to disagree with you.
So we'll have to go back to the sources, but a mikvah is incredibly important. And for two reasons. One is, many people would say a synagogue, but one can daven anywhere. But even a cemetery, people can, be buried as it comes up. But a mikvah is essential, not just in the days of the Beit HaMikdash, when people needed to become purified from tumah, from impurity, to go to the temple and do certain things, but women who keep the laws of nidah, when they have their monthly menstruation, for them to be able to go back and be with their husbands, to have children, etc., like that, they have to go to a mikvah. And there are many Jews today, men, who choose to go to the mikvah as a spiritual experience before Yom Kippur. Some go even more regularly. So whether or not a cemetery is the first thing that's built, a mikvah is incredibly important. Those two are very important, far more than a synagogue, which you can daven anywhere. But one of the things about the mikvahot is, well, not all Jews partake in it, and it's also essential for conversions as well. But not all Jews use a mikvah, although many do, and many are aware of it, even those who don't use it. We assume that mikvahot are something that has been around from time immemorial, that the Torah explicitly said, build a mikvah and or a cemetery, depending on Jane or Rabbi Dinyan's opinion on that. But again, this is not the hill I'm going to die on.
No. The only reason I'm saying it is in America, especially in the early days of settling places like Cleveland or Milwaukee, men came on their own, and their wives or their fiancés didn't come with them. They came later after they established themselves. So it may be that the feeling of a necessity for a mikvah might not have been as strong.
And again, it's something we could easily look up as to what the source for that trivia question is, what's actually obligated, but also the idea that history often dictates the reality is something that we'll come back to at the end of this class. But this week's Parasha of Metzora, which refers to the tzarat, the person who has the spiritual skin malady, which the Torah does not say explicitly what causes it. It implies that it has to do with one's speech. So the rabbi's understanding it as bad-mouthing someone, lashon hara, but regardless, someone has done something to bring the skin malady, which is not leprosy. It might be connected to some disease we have today, but it's definitely not leprosy, and it's definitely caused by some spiritual, in the way that it's both identified by Kohanim, and the way that it's cured, and the fact that it can grow on walls and human skin. You say, oh, it's mold, but mold doesn't really grow on skin. So this parasha is connected to last week's parasha of Tazria about the birth of women, particularly with things that happen to our body that cause us to be tameh, impure, so that we cannot give offerings. And the way to get out of it, I actually spoke on Shabbat, there are a number of steps. One is to remove the thing making you impure. Another might be to change one's actions or do some sort of reparative, emotional or physical work. And the next step is to dip in a ritual bath or waters known as a mikvah, a gathering, a collecting of waters. Technically, the ocean could work, but typically the traditional thing has been a physical stone bath or pool that is put together. But we're going to look at, because the word mikvah is not used in this context. So the question is, how do we know that we need a mikvah? So we're actually going to look at a verse from a parsha coming up in a week or two, and then we're going to go back to verses from this week's parasha and look at that. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at this verse and then see how the rabbis understood it. So Jane, I'll give you 1 and 2. First from Vayikra 22:6. So this week's parasha is just chapters 14 and 15, but we'll get to 22 in a few weeks. But go ahead, please. Source number 1.
The person who has touched any such shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat of the holy things unless he bathe his flesh with water.
Excellent. And any such, meaning anything that can cause tuma, whether it be the carcass of an animal or some bodily emission, all kinds of different things that can cause it. But the important thing there is in the Hebrew, how do they do that if they want to be able to eat holy things? They need to rachatz, and the word rachatz means to wash. Besaro means specifically his, but it means one's flesh. B'mayim, in water. Wash one's flesh or skin, better translation. Wash one's skin in water. Great. So when we read that, we say, oh, that's the mitzvah of mikvah. And now as we look at a collection of rabbinic writings, midrashim specifically from the Sifra, and the Sifra often has, midrashim both have interesting stories and takes, but they often have halachic, like practical implications for what the Torah is saying. We don't know exactly who and when compiled the Sifra and when it was done, but we think it was put together by a Rabbi Chia, who is quoted all throughout the Talmud, and some 30 of his midrashim in the Talmud make up the Sifra. So there's a lot of guesses that it's probably probably Rabbi Chia, who compiled it. So we're guessing the Sifra is around the end of the 3rd century, the Common Era. And these dates are important, as we'll see at the end. But by the end of the 3rd century, we have this midrash. Go ahead, Jane, source number 2.
Unless he has washed his body in water. Perhaps he should wash one limited time at a time. Scripture teaches, when the sun sets, he shall be clean. Just as the setting of the sun occurs all at once, so too in water, all at once.
So the initial question of the midrash is, all it says is wash his body. So why can't he take a shower or wash his body the way most people take a bath? How do we know that it needs to be a mikvah, a body of water, and one can dip their entire body in, which is not what the Torah is saying here. It doesn't even say dip. It just says wash his body. So this is the way that they derive it. It says that he washes his body and it'll be pure when the sun sets. Well, the sun sets all in one smooth motion, I guess. I mean, that's basically experientially. And just like the sun sets all at once, it doesn't set a little bit at a time, which I guess it kind of does, but we'll put that aside for now. So too, one has to dip all at once. So there's a lot of this is a big stretch here. The sun sets all at once, so therefore dip all at once. So when you get a midrash like this, usually what it means is the practice exists. The idea of dipping one's body in a mikvah is widespread. It is the practice. It is the mitzvah for purification, at least as late as the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era. But they don't know why, because they look at the verse and that's not exactly what it says. So they have to go back and reconstruct a possible meaning for it. And you see that. I love studying the history of customs and minhagim and Jewish law in general, and you see that a lot. Now, that does not mean that a mikvah is not what the Torah intended. It does not mean that is not what God intended, and it's not part of the proper understanding of our tradition. But if you're just reading the text, it doesn't really say that. So that's why this source is a stretch. But we're going to see that continued in the 12th century in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, where certainly by the 12th century, there was no question. Like it had been done for hundreds and hundreds, at least at least a millennium at this point, had people been dipping in a mikvah. So when he comes to it, though, he still needs to justify it, even though for him, it's, of course we do it, but I still need to, talk it out. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you could please take source number 3 from Rambam's Mishnah Torah, 12th century, in his section on mikvot, please.
Every place that the Torah speaks of washing flesh and laundering of clothing to purify from the impurities, nothing other than immersion in the entire body in a mikvah is meant. And that which is said of a man with a discharge, without having rinsed his hands in water, that is to say that he must immerse his entire body. And the same is true for all other impure people, that if one immersed his entire body, Aside from the tip of your small finger, he remains impure. And although all of these things are known only from tradition, literally from an oral transmission, it is nevertheless said in the written Torah, it must be put into water. It shall be unclean until the even. Then it shall be clean. A basic principle applying to all that are impure, that they should be put into water.
Excellent, thank you. So he makes a very big admission here, and not one he's like, not one that would undercut his argument here, but he says the Torah doesn't say anything about dipping our entire body all at once, because he's interpreting this as not only as a mikvah obvious, whenever anyone needs to purify their body, it has to be in a mikvah, meaning total immersion of the entire body at once, such that if somebody dips their entire body into a pool of water, but their pinky is sticking out, that dipping is unkosher. And I know this from experience when I've witnessed converts doing it. And then I have not witnessed a woman doing it after she has finished from her period of menstruation. But I know my wife has told me that there is an attendant there called the mikvah chick often, and she will, if the woman dips down and she comes up and some strands of hair were sticking out over the water, or a foot or anything like that, she'll say dip again. And that's why some people have the custom when they do dip to do it 2 or 3 times to make sure at least one of them is kosher. So that's the standard understanding of the law, not necessarily the number of times, but one has to dip their entire body simultaneously. But he says that's not what the Torah says. So how do we know it? Mipi hashmua, meaning literally from the mouth of something which is heard, i.e. an oral tradition passed down. Now, for Jewish law today, there's an understanding that there is that which is written in the Torah, but there's also a tradition that has been passed down from Moshe through the generations that explains how to interpret the Torah. Now, this class is not explicitly about that, but it's worth taking a moment to discuss what that means. Because one understanding of it could be that literally Moshe Rabbeinu, standing up on Har Sinai, had memorized the Shulchan Aruch and every book ever published by Art Scroll, and he just had people memorize them and say, in 2022, there's going to be a book on Jewish law in English in America, and here's what it's going to say. That's not the most common understanding of it. The more common understanding is it's kind of a combined view. There were certain traditions about how to do a mitzvah. There are certain mitzvot in the Torah that are not explicit how to pull it off exactly, around tefillin, tzitzit, etc. But clearly they were doing them. So Moshe, with God's stamp of approval, must have said, this is how you do the mitzvah. And then that was passed down. That's why we have sets of tefillin that are basically identical to what we have today, that are thousands of years old. But the other thing that most will agree on is that what was passed down was principles, how to understand and interpret the text as things change from generation to generation, that the text was purposefully left vague in certain points and certain times so that the rabbis of each generation could interpret it differently. But regardless, the way that the rules that the rabbis were given that were passed down for hundreds of years, and this is reasonable. If someone says, I'm not a faithful believer, but it is reasonable that certain traditions and ways to understand the text probably were passed down over hundreds, if not well over 1,000 years. And based on that tradition, they interpreted washing as a whole body dipping thing. And at least by the 3rd century, and we'll see even earlier, Jews understood washing as dipping your whole body in. So regardless of whether or not that's what the text says, the way our tradition has developed and the methods and tools we have used have led us to understand this mitzvah as mikvah, and it is consistent with the system of rabbinic interpretation. So if you want to say, I'm only going by the text, then we would call you a Karaite, and you would be exiled and you would be out of the game. But if you want to say, I know the text doesn't say that, but we have a tradition of how to understand the text, rules and methods, and even voting by majority rules. Even if we agree that's not what the text says, but the majority of rabbis choose to interpret the text this way, and we have a principle that if the majority of rabbis choose to vote and the majority rules this way, and the people adopt the practice, then it almost, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but that's what the mitzvah becomes. And that's important. I want to pause on that for a moment. Almost regardless of what the text says, if our tradition interprets it in a certain way, the majority of scholars accept it, and the people accept it, it becomes the mitzvah. And I'm not saying that to devalue what we do, but rather that is a system that we are given by Moshe and by God that allows the text to evolve slowly, but still to evolve. So that's the traditional understanding of it. And that is how, as Rambam says it, it's okay for it not to be exactly what the text says, but it is no less authoritative. So I'm going to pause here. Even though I said this is not what the class is all about, I just dropped a lot. Maybe we'll do a specific class on this concept, but any questions on this first section and the principles I just laid down about interpreting the Torah and how it's not necessarily what the text says, but it's no less authoritative if it's part of the oral tradition. Excellent. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And now this next section here is interesting because there's not a resolution to it. My point in this class is not to say, oh, here's the magic answer that wraps it up nicely. It's rather to say, here's a challenge, and we need to read the text and take on all challengers, as it were. So this section here, and Gloria and Leonard, I'll give you each a few sources because they're short. This is showing how interpreting the text that we saw earlier, verse 22, as using wash the body, as wash the entire body, dipping all at once, really doesn't make a lot of sense, because the use of the word rachatz, wash, is used in plenty of other places, and it clearly does not mean that. So Gloria here, also later in the, or not later, but back in the book of Shemot, and it doesn't really matter the context of some of these verses, it's more how the word is used. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 1.
For Aharon and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet thereat.
Excellent.
And
So here
all-
it just, what's that?
I was just going to go on.
Oh, well, I just want to very quickly, this one, it uses the word rachatz, wash, and it's here, it's not a full body dipping, it's doing different body parts, not the entire body. Simple as that. Now, one could say, well, in the earlier case, it says rachatz basaro, his entire flesh. That's how you know it's all the body at once. And here it's specifically different body parts. That's a possible rejection of this as being a challenge to our source, but we'll see other sources onwards. So go ahead, please, Gloria.
And all the elders of that city that are nearest to the slave.
Oh no, have we lost you for a moment, Gloria? I'm going to keep reading, and if she comes back, great. So all the elders of that city that are nearest to the slain man, this is a person, a dead body is found between two towns, and they don't know which town they came from. There's this ceremony of essentially taking responsibility that each town failed, and they take the neck of a calf, a heifer, and they break the neck, and it's symbolic as saying, innocent blood has been spilled. And until we find the criminal, there needs to be retribution. So we're going to kill this animal as a kind of symbol that someone out there deserves to die, and we're taking responsibility for it. But the important thing here is that when they do that ceremony, they need to wash their hands. And again, washing here is about a specific body part, not a whole body part. Oh, we've lost Gloria and Leonard. Hopefully they'll come back. And then the next one, and this is a big one, that's really interesting how it's used and interpreted, at least in this context. Source number 3, it talks about Bathsheba, when she was bathing on the roof, you know, the famous Leonard Cohen song, and King David saw her and fell in love with her. And one could challenge this, but all it talks about is her bathing. And one thinks, oh, this actually should be a knockout source for bathing, meaning going into a bath all at once, except she's bathing on the roof. And the idea that you have an entire full body mikvah made of stone, and their baths were always built into the ground. They didn't have a modern kind of bath that we had. To have a giant stone bath on the roof of her house is, I don't think we have any evidence. I think there's literally zero evidence that that ever existed when that would have happened. Anything like that, like any of the baths that we have going back in any culture all over Egypt and Greece and everything, would have crushed her house. So it is virtually impossible. Again, anything's possible, but it's virtually impossible she had a bath on a roof. So what did it mean that she was rachatz herself? It meant that she was washing herself little by little. So almost certainly in this context, washing does not mean full immersion. And then we actually have, and Eric, I will unmute you for the next 2 verses. We have something explicitly going the other way, which is we have a word for dipping, for immersing in the Torah that's not used in the context of washing. And it's we actually have it in this week's Parasha, source number 4. Please, Eric.
He shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the crimson stuff, and the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird in the fresh water. Sprinkle on the house 7 times.
Now here, it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, it might actually mean full immersion, but the point is that we do have a word for fully immersing in, but more importantly, in the book of Melachim Bet, the second book of Kings, 5:14, and again, we don't need to worry about the context, but this person, Naaman, with the word yitbol, dipping in, go ahead, Eric.
So he, Naaman, went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan.
So this is a complete and total body immersion. And the word here is not rachatz, it is dipping. So if the Torah wanted somebody who is impure to dip themselves, which is certainly what the practice was clearly later, then why didn't they use the word vayitbol? So the next thing that we want to start looking at is, so here the Torah clearly doesn't say this, but we know at some point, obviously, people were purifying themselves by dipping their entire bodies. So we started with a midrash from the 3rd century, but the question is that the earliest written recorded source? And just because something's recorded doesn't mean it's the first time something happened. In fact, usually when something's written down, it's something that already happened, potentially years, decades, or centuries earlier. But the earliest written account that explicitly talks about somebody having to do a full body immersion is in one of the Qumranic texts. And again, these were found in the caves of Qumran, but they were dated to be from about the 1st century, from a Jewish group that was kind of a breakaway group that was obsessed with purity. So if you want to know the laws of purity, you want to check with these guys. So I'll just take this source. So it says, and the identification of it is because they can't say from the book of Vayikra, from the book of this, it was just their crazy identification system for this massive wealth of documents. So whatever come in contact with semen, with a man who spills seed, which is a cause of impurity, whether an impurity or any vessel, shall be immersed, and meaning dipped in completely. And it uses the word yitbol, doesn't use rachatz, but it talks about a common kind of impurity that in the Torah, this kind of impurity, it said rachatz, but here it's clarifying should be total immersion. And whoever bears it shall immerse the garments upon which the emission was, as well as the vessel which bears it, to be immersed in water. It uses yitbol, both the person and the vessel. So explicitly here, this is almost like a book of Jewish law, like the Mishnah Torah, saying when the Torah said rachatz, wash, it clearly meant yitbol. So certainly for over 2,000 years, the understanding of any kind of impurity is to be dipping. Now, again, one could challenge this and say maybe it's only this kind of impurity, but it's still showing that there was an idea of complete and total immersion for purity as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. But the next thing that we want to look at is there archaeological evidence? Why don't we just try and find the earliest mikveh? And if we find one that's 4,000 years old, boom, end of story. But the earliest one we can find, which again, doesn't mean it's the earliest one in existence. It's just the earliest one that we can find. And we have some, what was it? There at least a couple thousand, maybe it's 1,000 ancient mikvaot that clearly belong to the Jewish or the Israelite people. So the earliest one we have is the end of the 2nd century in the caves of Qumran. Now, that would kind of line up more or less with even though that Qumranic text we just read is a little bit earlier, it's pretty much consistent that the mikvah would have been built around then. And then the Midrash, we started with the Sifras, the end of the 3rd century, where it's codified as law. But based on all of this evidence, the Torah doesn't explicitly talk about dipping. And all of the evidence that we have is really only looking at the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. The question is, what were they doing in the times of King David, in the times of Nehemiah, in the times of the 1st temple? Were they not dipping in mikvaot? Was this a new procedure? And this is where I don't have and here's the knockout answer. You certainly have academic sources. And by the way, I've read those academic papers. They do not have a knockout punch. If you want to say, well, what's the scholarly answer that, even though it's not the orthodox answer, it makes it all work together? We don't have that. There's a hypothesis. And for any scientists on here, the difference between a hypothesis and a theory is quite proven. So even though we call gravity a theory, and they're like, oh, well, it's a theory, it's just an idea. One of my professors always said, if anybody says gravity's just a theory, it's just an idea, you say, oh, is it? And then push them down the stairs and say, how theoretical was that? We didn't actually do that. But a hypothesis is an idea which might be correct, but it's really just an idea that hasn't been proven yet. So the hypothesis that I have read is that indeed, for the first hundreds, if not thousands of years of our people, the idea of completely dipping in a bath was not a thing. And part of that reason might be is that we didn't really have baths. Why is that important? Because sometime around the 1st and 2nd century, the Greeks started introducing something called a hip bath, which was is not over your head, but it was high enough. If you poured water on yourself, you could go into the fetal position, which, by the way, anyone who has ever been to a mikvah, that is how people, it's not 7 or 8 or 9 feet deep. It's I've never gone in with my own body, but I've gone in to dip like plates. I have to go today actually to kasher or to toivel some new dishes and stuff like that for Pesach. But it's maybe 4, 5 feet deep. So how does a tall person do it? They go up into the fetal position. So a hip bath that the Greeks invented, it is possible that people could have immersed their entire bodies in there. And if the Jews are now living amongst the Greeks and the Romans, and they have a procedure by which they need to purify through water, well, much easier than sitting there and washing one body part at a time is to take a dip in a bath. Now, why the rabbi said you can't just sit in the bath and then pour water over yourself, that's again one of the mysteries, and why this hypothesis is not yet proven. And if you actually look at the development of rabbinic law, they have a lot of rules about how you draw the water, how the bath for the mikveh is made. And in some ways, one could read it as responding directly to these Greek baths and rejecting the idea that you can sit in a bath and have water poured over you. You have to be in a bath in which the water is already collected, i.e. a mikvah, which means collected together, and you have to immerse all at once. So it does appear that there's a fair amount of evidence based on when those rabbinic writings in the Talmud were written, that it was responding to this new invention of the bath. Now, if that is the correct answer, does that mean that the mikvah is not the proper way to do the mitzvah? No. And that's kind of the point here, is that the development of rabbinic tradition, the oral transmission, did not write the collected books of all of Jewish law that would be useful for time immemorial. Rabbis have said before, if the Torah had every law and every eventuality from dipping in a mikvah to issues of brain death, the Torah would be 700 feet long at least, and it would be not a useless book, but it would be almost impossible to use. But by the Torah and the oral tradition giving principles for how to interpret and how to react and respond to the world around, that not only gave authority to rabbis coming up with or understanding the law in a new way, but also when they did it, it meant that that law, that new interpretation, has just as much authority as the Torah of God. Now, there is a distinction there between laws that are clearly explicitly written in the Torah and laws that are developed by the rabbis. That's why this is not easy to just say, oh, it's a rabbinic law, because the rabbis are quite explicit. Dipping in a mikvah is a Torah level law, but it doesn't say that in there. So that is what we have accepted as a tradition. But these conversations, regardless of where we end up, need to happen. So as an Orthodox Jew, where do I end up? A mikvah is part of the tradition. It is understood as obligated by the Torah, and the oral tradition is as authoritative to me as the written text of the Torah. But just because that's where I end up doesn't mean we shouldn't still have the conversation and be open to these other realities of history influencing it. So maybe there wasn't a mikvah in the times of King David, but that doesn't mean the mikvah is not the mitzvah today. And the challenge is, can one make those two realities work? And that's both exciting and also dangerous is not the right word, but very challenging to tradition. But the whole point is the oral tradition was meant to develop and change as history moved forward. But it can't do that if you deny that that's what it was meant to do.